We work in lots of areas, but something that's of particular interest to me is how we adapt Scotland's built environment to the climate change impacts that we know are coming. Something that's really important for the built environment to consider is that even if we achieve net zero, the impacts from climate change that we're going to face are really quite considerable.
So we start these focus discussions with adaptation, how we adapt our places and practices to the reality of climate change, because it's where we're forced to confront nature and what we've done to it. We're going to look at what's coming, take collective responsibility for our shared future, and talk about how we're going to deliver adaptation, to invest wisely, to protect the vulnerable, to give up what nature will take from us, and to learn that hard lesson that sits at the heart of the climate and biodiversity crisis, that we are a small part of a much bigger living system, a part of nature, not a part from nature.
We run the Adaptation Scotland programme on behalf of Scottish Government. Our models are, if anything, they're being too conservative about the sort of impacts that we are seeing. We're seeing impacts today that climate scientists thought we would see in the 2080s. I would say as a scientist that guidance and regulations are currently lagging between 12 and 20 years behind the latest science. And we have to remember that. So that's why it's really important to consider the reasonable worst case. And as designers and placemakers use the precautionary principle, what was the reasonable worst case 10 years ago in climate science is now the most likely case, and we keep seeing this progression. Meeting current legislation does not equal safety. And it's really hard to square this circle. Climate impacts are happening so fast and the science is changing so fast. It's really difficult to incorporate that latest knowledge into the tools that we use to regulate and design our built environment. We basically have three choices: mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. We are going to do some of each. The question is, what is the mix going to be? I did like the quote from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who said, "Our world needs climate action on all fronts, everything, everywhere, all at once," and that is true, and particularly I would say within the built environment. An awful lot of natural systems are getting really close to tipping points, and natural systems such as boreal forests, the Amazon rainforest, the carbon stores within our soils. If we warm the planet to the point where these natural stores of carbon are released, we will initiate a spiral of warming that we wouldn't be able to stop. Collapse of major agricultural regions around the world, or collapse of insect populations, really kind of existential stuff. There is considerable uncertainty about the AMOC, so this is the kind of the Gulf Stream. A paper released just this week in Nature. Could Scotland get colder? It is a possibility. We've seen the Gulf Stream weaken 33% since 1993. Is there a tipping point where that will shut off? We don't know. All of these things, it's really hard to project on changes that we're seeing for the first time in human history. It's really hard to understand what the long-term consequences will be. But we're seeing real intensity of rainfall, perhaps way beyond the design standards of our buildings and our drainage systems. Adaptation, this is very much the Cinderella of climate change. But adaptation was always felt to be the one that we'd only do if we were too stupid to cut carbon emissions. Well, we've been talking about cutting carbon emissions since the Rio summit, and emissions continue to rise year on year. Atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases continue to rise year on year. So, we need to adapt. Adaptation is something that we all do, and humans have done for millennia. It is so much cheaper to design in resilience and adaptation now than to literally have to mop up people's lives and infrastructure and rebuild again and again. We appear to have gone in the media straight from it's not a problem, it's not real, to it's too late to do anything. I always used to joke that climate science was the one area where the scientists were more scared than the Daily Mail, but the top centre headline is from the Daily Mail, and I really want us to move back from that view. It's not too late to do anything.
We need connectivity, we need nature to be threaded through our urban spaces for us to be connected to the nature that is there, and we need our public services to collaborate in effective inclusive adaptation action. And I think collaboration is one of those key active words throughout the plan, that this problem is too big, too close to us, too complex. It requires us to collaborate if we're going to see just outcomes.
Floodwater, nasty, smelly, dirty stuff that ruins everything that you hold dear. We're a charity set up over 10 years ago, mainly funded by the Scottish Government to support individuals and communities at risk of flooding. We've seen a huge increase in multiple simultaneous flood events across Scotland's geography. What we try to do at the Scottish Flood Forum is to handhold and kind of lead them toward that resilient future. My plea to you and to any of the colleagues in your fraternity or association is to think about the future design and build of homes.
For me, it's about joining up adaptation and all those processes so that we think of the big picture. I don't know if we can get a handle on it. I hope we can, but that really means us all working together.
The area is actually one of the most deprived in Scotland, so the least likely to be able to cope with this suffering.
Brechin, a good percentage of Brechin was devastated by floods, sort of mid-October, and we've been dealing with the kind of aftermath of that. You know, we've been hit with 8 storms in 10 weeks. There's only been 3 days since mid-September it hasn't rained in the town. You had a supposed once in 200 years freak, hit twice in 2 years. There is a flood defence there. It worked perfectly well for 3.8 metres. That's a metre above what previous records were. But when it gets to 5.5, 6 metres, pumps in the walls aren't going to make a difference. And that's unfortunately what we got hit with. People were opening their doors and just getting to the full height of the door. I think seeing the relevancy of climate change and how it impacts them is maybe something that a lot of people in that area of Brechin didn't see until very recently. That's been twice in 2 years now. It's been 200-300 homes in the town, bridges are gone, roads are gone, a community's gone. A change is something that's going to be needed. I think something to buy into would be good, a clear definition of what the way forward is.
There's a lot of things that just haven't been done. We had housing ministers, we had first ministers, we've had everyone in the town promising to do everything they could. That hasn't been a great deal. We've got businesses that have been given £1,500 for losing everything. Ourselves, we are 30,000 down. We employed a contractor who kept his van down at the bottom of the road with the materials. They are someplace in the North Sea now. But because his business wasn't based there, he doesn't get the £3,000 grant. So that the actual knock-on for everyone is huge. We are half a mile up the hill. If we flood, God knows what's going to happen. But our flood insurance has went from 2,000 to 3,800. Now I've made everyone really happy. I'll let you give back to someone else.
I'm reflecting on the sort of tragic flooding in Brechin, and I'm reminded of a story I read in the New York Times last June. 2 of the biggest insurers of homes in the United States pulled out of a small community called California and are not offering any new policies to homeowners in California, 39 million people. That is, I suppose, potentially a very proactive business decision on their part. They've been proactive. We need to be more proactive in this route.
SEPA produce very detailed flood maps, and I think it's something like 250 plus 1,000 homes that are anticipated at being in flood risk by, I think it's 2050, something like that. But equally, the insurance industry has more detailed maps than SEPA.
If we're raising attention to the fact that flood risk makes this street, devalued, if that street then groups together and takes action, what we should be seeing is a financial system that has inbuilt rewards for that investment, because at the moment there is no reward for the investment when it comes to selling that asset.
We know that Fairburn in Wales is not insurable anymore. They get no money for flood defences. So what are the Scottish Government's plans on actively managing retreats when necessary?
So Scotland has, just last year, we produced new guidance, coastal change adaptation guidance. This guidance is what they call trigger-based and dynamic adaptive pathways. So it's advising those with coastal estates and those with responsibility for coastal management to make decisions based on the current situation that you find yourself in, but prepare to change course if triggers or impacts happen, and that you might need to change your approach at the coast. So there's some really good examples on the Dynamic Coast website. One of the things that people were saying today is we don't have space or budget or time to fail, and actually we know that we're going to have to adapt and get very good at adaptation very fast. And not everything we do is going to work. We are going to have to try new and innovative approaches. Scottish Government have got some great funding, the Coastal Change Adaptation Budget, and that is specifically for local authorities and their partners to try new innovative approaches and to recognise that any learning of the good, the bad, the ugly will be helpful for everyone, and kind of build this shared evidence base.
So it's a matter of conflict and priority. I mean, you've got like your nature, communities, infrastructure, economy, collaboration, but it's how do you actually going to prioritise these? How are you going to overcome the conflicts between them?
On the prioritisation point, I showed a slide of the type of different measures that you might want to take for net zero versus adaptation. There is crossover, but there are also contradictions. We don't want to be designing in net zero measures that massively increase our risk, but equally our adaptation actions shouldn't be carbon intensive. Recovering a property after a flood with a dehumidifier has got a massive carbon consequence. Building traditional grey flood defences, massive embodied carbon. We need to be thinking about all sides of this, and it is incredibly difficult.
The Scottish Government to me always feels like it's some guy called Bob with a list of things about the length of War and Peace on his arm that he's got to try and cover, and I appreciate you'd be equivalent of something like the 11th largest UK department in terms of civil servant numbers, but I was curious, do you feel like you're getting enough capacity internally to tackle this kind of remit?
Most important thing is that the government gives a completely clear strategic direction in terms of policy, legislation, and where their investments are going to be for the next 10 to 15 years around this particular topic, so that the private sector can then also support the just transition.
It's a tough, complex, multi-dimensional problem, as many wicked problems are. So do we have some of the fundamentals there? Yes, we've got a good statutory evidence base. We've got some of the structures to talk to people and make connections across. Do we have the sort of structures and architecture to plan at the appropriate level, maybe get people to collaborate across a catchment? Maybe we don't yet. That would take more resource.
I mean, I've worked in local government for years. I remember having elected members coming to me and saying, why should I put money into future adaptation for a future potential problem when I haven't got crisis care for kids that need removing from an abusive situation today? It's the worst possible time to be trying to think about this issue because we are all so constrained, but it is, unfortunately, is where we find ourselves.
You know, when we had the pandemic, we moved heaven and earth because of the immediacy of what we had to deal with. Our adaptability was incredible, individually, organisationally, politically. Because of that reaction, we were able to find the vaccine quicker. You know, that concentration of focus of effort and of even breaking our rules for the right reasons. It seems to me that, you know, we can do it. We've just done it recently. And all this idea of talking and consultation and policy. So I just wondered, you know, what rules should we break? How quickly should we be moving to action? Making mistakes and learning as we go, learn by doing.
I thought I'd just say something positive. So we've just launched our Climate Ready Edinburgh plan, which is our adaptation plan, because we like to take action. So we'd love you to look it up and give us all of your comments on that plan and help us in the built environment side of things. So we'd very much love you guys to help us formulate some actions that we can put in.
Every fraction of warming that we can avoid will save lives, and it will save millions.